Welcome to episode 28 of ECTEL Bytes. The show is a production of the Eastern Caribbean Telecommunications Authority. I'm your host, Coretta Crooks-Charles, ECTEL's Communications and Media Relations Manager. We use this platform to provide you with information about developments taking place in electronic communications by the Directorate or like-minded organizations. Today, our special guest is a young man who is working on an important project called Smart Seas, aimed at using ICTs to enhance resilience and to protect the lives of Caribbean small-scale fishers. Mr. Tariq Mohammed is the Project Consultant Officer with the International Telecommunication Union, or the ITU, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome him to ECTEL Bytes. Welcome, Tariq.
Good morning, Coretta, and thank you so much for having me.
All right, so you are a project officer consultant with the ITU, and you're based in Trinidad and Tobago. Give us a brief overview of what your role entails.
Thank you. So as a project officer consultant under the Smart Seas project, my role is really centered around looking at the scope of our project, which is that of small-scale fishers in the sphere of ICTs, and working with the different agencies within the ecosystem of maritime telecommunications to really fill the gaps that exist in accessible, affordable ICTs and to bring the communications to the fishers, emphasizing the enabling environment. So that role really entails a lot of policy and regulatory developments, a bit of research and analysis on what are the current as well as upcoming technologies that may exist, as well as developing and I suppose, we may discuss this later on, but the whole Smart Seas toolkit, which is resources for our different Caribbean governments and administrations.
Okay, so we're going to go into the discussion about the project in a while, but I like to ask this question because there might be young persons or anybody out there listening who might want to know, what do you study to become, a project officer consultant, so to speak, with the ITU. So you studied electrical and computer engineering at the University of the West Indies. What influenced your decision to pursue studies in that field, Tariq?
Thank you. So project officer isn't really directly related to engineering, but my role actually first started off with being a radio engineer consultant, which evolved into me becoming a project officer. So my studies, I have an undergraduate bachelor's degree in electrical and computer engineering from the University of the West Indies, which is where I'm also currently pursuing my MPhil PhD in the same field. Originally, I didn't plan on studying engineering. I wanted, or my interest rather, was more in a social science degree. And so I applied for a few different things. So it was, I think, sociology or criminology. I applied for computer science. I applied for electrical engineering. And even though I got through to all, I sat down one day and I said, well, of each of these options, which would make me most marketable in the Caribbean? And so I went with engineering. And what I can say is, even though electrical and computer engineering does sound like a lot of math, it does sound like a lot of physics and theory, the real underlying skills that you develop through an engineering program is transferable to any field, any sector, really about problem solving and working with a problem to bring a solution to whoever you're serving.
Awesome. Thanks for that response, Tariq. And the fact that you are based in Trinidad, but you're working with the ITU, that's admirable as well. So you decided to stay in the Caribbean, but here you are making, a bigger impact through the ITU. All right, so let's go into the project now. What inspired the development of the Smart Seas toolkit, and why is it important for the Caribbean region?
So the Smart Seas project, as you mentioned at the beginning, is a joint initiative of the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, the Caribbean Telecommunications Union, CTU, as well as the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, which is the regulator for ICTs in Trinidad and Tobago. So this project was really centered around the fact that while we have been making momentous strides in the digital inclusion and bringing meaningful and inclusive connectivity for all, on land, gaps still exist in bringing connectivity to those who are out at sea or those who may not make their living or spend most of their time on land. So this is why we started looking at the case of small-scale fishers who represent over 90% of the world fisheries fleet and are responsible for about just under half of the fish that is involved in our food chain. So about half of the fish that we eat on a daily basis is caught by small-scale fishers. Within the Caribbean, statistics do sort of falter in terms of what their exact numbers are totally, as well as the number or statistics of disasters at sea that occur. Though we always see in news from time to time that fishers have gone missing, there have been an increase in piracy attacks, as well as the fact that the weather and climate-related disasters as a result of climate change have further put these fishers at risk. So apart from the typical person that we would serve in telecommunications that would increase their digital inclusion, we also have not just the fact of livelihoods that we're trying to support, but a critical nature to save their lives. So under the Smart Seas project, we're looking at both life-saving as well as livelihood supporting communications and ICTs at sea. And so it's important, as most of the Caribbean countries are island states, and we do have a very thriving maritime as well as fishing sector. So these really motivated the development of the Smart Seas project as well as the toolkit. The toolkit itself, though, is more along the lines of supporting the actors and agents within the enabling environment. So what are the different actors and agents that are involved in communications at sea? Are these the regulators? Are these the coast guards? Are these the different agencies that are involved in training? Are these the fisheries officers and fisheries administrations, the maritime administrations? So within this toolkit, we've done a mapping of all the different actors and agencies within the ecosystem that we're looking at and produced a cadre of online, freely accessible resources that can support the policy and regulation, strengthen the capacity as well as the operations within the sector as it relates to maritime telecommunications.
Okay, that was a lot, Tariq, but you did mention something I was going to ask you more about. You did say that the project will address the unique challenges that they face, and you did go into piracy and climate change and the weather events and so on. But you also mentioned you don't quite have the statistics, because you're right. Oftentimes on the news you do hear of the fishers getting lost at sea, and this does not just affect them, but imagine their family members and so on. So I was hoping you would have expanded on that a bit, but I think you did a pretty good job answering that already. So that would have been my follow-up question. Okay, so can you explain the role of ICT in enhancing disaster resilience for the fishers?
Thank you. So as you know, based on the pandemic as well as otherwise, we have been moving towards a more digital society. So as we continue to advance digital developments, the gap between those who can afford and access it and those who cannot continue to widen. So we experience this a lot in a lot of the work that we do here at the ITU, throughout the ICT sector, as well as I'm sure ECTEL is actively involved in that. So quite apart from looking at, as I mentioned earlier, the livelihood supporting component, there's also the life-saving and disaster resilience, as you're asking me on right now. ICTs actually play a very critical role in all four phases. So there are four phases of what we call the disaster management cycle. So it's preparation, mitigation, response, and recovery. And throughout that cycle, we see that there are phases that happen before the disaster, during, as well as after. How do we recover from that? And so ICTs play a critical role in the overall communication of information. So if we are expecting some hazardous weather alerts, or if there is a spotting or a surge of pirates in a particular area, using ICTs to communicate that information can play a very critical role in the whole preparation and mitigation of a disaster before it occurs. Of course, during a disaster at sea, such as a sinking vessel, or perhaps a fishing vessel has gone adrift, the engine has shut down and they're drifting aimlessly out at sea now and at the mercy of the elements. communications can play a very critical role in calling out for help or making that connection, whether it be with other seafarers, coast guards, and the whole rescue coordination ecosystem to help the necessary response to be received to whatever situation is being experienced. And of course, afterwards, if there is unfortunately some very horrible circumstances that exist, how is it that, you know, we have to communicate to convert it from, you know, a search and rescue mission to a recovery mission, recovering of, unfortunately, bodies in a lot of these cases. So ICTs play a very critical role in strengthening the disaster resilience, and we really want to make that case for the continued adoption and increase in adoption of ICTs in the maritime sector, particularly for our small-scale fishers.
Okay. What are some of the gaps in maritime communications that have been identified so far, and how does the project plan to address them?
Thank you. So we actually started the project off with a gap analysis of the 4 countries that we are looking at, right? So Trinidad and Tobago serves as the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center for 4 countries: Barbados, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as well as, of course, Trinidad and Tobago. This is enshrined under an international treaty called the SAR, or the International Convention of Maritime Search and Rescue, which instantiates us as this rescue coordination center here in Trinidad, the responsibility falling to our Coast Guard. And that covers approximately 62,500 square nautical miles, which is a very large area of both land and water to be covered. So we started off the project with a gap analysis, looking at these 4 countries, looking at this region, and we've identified a number of gaps as well as other observations within the sector. Firstly, with respect to the ITU, all governments that are member states of the ITU, which includes all of ECTEL's countries, are responsible and are obligated under the international treaty called the Radio Regulations to notify the ITU of its existing coast stations. So these coast stations, as the name sort of applies, are stations that are on land. So they're land-based stations that serve the maritime area through radio communications. And these play a very vital role in disaster resilience, in communications at sea, overall port operations, and other communication aspects. And so we've realized that of the 20 CTU member states, only 2 in history have ever notified the ITU. So only 2 have ever fulfilled this obligation under the radio regulations. The project, however, has been working with a number of different administrations to fill these gaps. And I can very safely report that we have filled the gaps in 2 more countries. So that is Trinidad and Tobago, as well as St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And we are still working with some other administrations and are still in the process of preparing these notifications. So through the project, we have increased the visibility of this gap that exists, and we are actively working with administrations to fill that. I will, however, like to just put a shout out there to any administrations that have not fulfilled the obligation yet, that if they are interested, we are happy to support them. In addition to that, I mentioned earlier that we did a mapping of the ecosystem to understand what are the different players and actors and agents within the maritime communications ecosystem. What we realized is, quite apart from identifying the actors and the agencies, we also did a mapping of what their different roles and responsibilities are, as well as what they should be under international best practice as well as regulations. And what we realize is that, 1, there are gaps that exist in conducting and executing particular roles, in the sense that they don't necessarily, from our understanding, actually take place. There are gaps in the assignment and carrying out of these roles, as well as in some cases, there is the complete opposite, where we have multiple agencies doing the same role in duplicate and doing them slightly differently without communicating with one another. So there are, on both ends, the gaps that exist in what should be done and isn't, and then there's a duplication. And so that's one of the other, key gaps or key observations that we've known.
Okay. You mentioned, Tariq, that Trinidad and Tobago serves as the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center for Barbados, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and of course, as well as Trinidad and Tobago. What's the significance of that?
The significance of that is Trinidad being the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, we are responsible for working with the other countries, or all four of the countries within our jurisdiction as mapped out, to coordinate, respond, and essentially recover in the unfortunate circumstances, any disasters related to maritime. So whether it be that vessels have gone adrift, whether they've been destroyed, whether they have been under attack by piracy, or there are persons missing, Trinidad and Tobago, through their Coast Guard, are the coordinator responsible for this region. And so we are obligated to lend support to all of the countries within this region to assist in the maritime search and rescue side of things and coordinate any response that are faced in maritime disasters.
Okay, thanks, Tariq. We recently had Ms. Ria Lewis from the NTRC in St. Vincent, and she shared with us that the Global Maritime Distress and Safety System, that's the GMDSS, it was implemented by the National Telecommunications and Regulatory Commission, the NTRC, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines under their USF, that's the Universal Service Fund, to facilitate emergency and non-emergency communications at sea. And to assist local fisherfolk, the NTRC has subsidized the cost of the GMDSS radios, and they conducted training sessions nationwide. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I'm just wondering, with this in mind, how will the recommendations and the resources from this project benefit other Caribbean countries beyond Trinidad and Tobago and the other three that you had mentioned?
Thank you. It's fantastic to hear that St. Vincent and the Grenadines has executed this project. A similar one was done in Grenada about a year ago, where they had used or leveraged their universal service funds to set up an island-wide GMDSS system. And I think that this is excellent best practice, as outside of the ECTEL member states, we haven't seen that any of the other CTU member states having any reference to maritime under their universal service frameworks. Now, this, which I should have probably mentioned before, is another gap that we see in the policy and regulatory environment, which means that there isn't enough visibility at that level, or there aren't the policy and regulatory practices that are there that would motivate the use of universal service funds to cover the maritime space, which is something that also motivated the project, as I mentioned earlier, having done a lot of work on land-based communications, maritime sort of lacking. So I think that is excellent work, and really other Caribbean countries should take that as an example of action items that can be done. Also fantastic to hear on the subsidy of costs for the fishers using the GMDSS solutions, as while these are best practice and international standards, often lie outside the accessibility and affordability reach of the fishers themselves. Of course, not only having or being able to afford these devices is one thing, but I very much like that you mentioned that there is the capacity building side of things, where you don't just purchase devices and hand it to them, but you also ensure that they are adequately resourced to operate competently the specialized devices that are used in maritime communications. Of course, using the example of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, this should be applicable to all other Caribbean countries, as all of us have a fishing industry, all of us have small-scale fishers within our territories, and there is the need to really bring affordable, accessible ICTs to them, which would benefit not only the socio-economic side of boosting our fishing and fisheries sector, but also contribute towards saving the lives. And so there are a number of items that we found under the project, and through the gap analysis and some other policy recommendations, we're happy to share a more detailed analysis on gaps that other Caribbean countries can fill, as well as some of the best practices that we have identified. But most definitely, using the example of Trinidad and Tobago and the 4 countries right now, it isn't our plan to only look at these 4 countries. It's just that under the limited scope that we have right now and limited timeline of the project, we're using this as an example that is applicable to the rest of the Caribbean, as well as worldwide, and transferable as well to other at-risk and other vulnerable communities.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that, Tariq. So we're almost at the end, but before we get there, can you walk us through the key components of the Smart Seas toolkit and how it will be accessed and used by the small scale fishers?
Thank you. So the Smart Seas Toolkit is a cadre of online resources that are currently available on each of our partners' websites. That is the ITU, CTU, as well as TAT. So if you Google Smart Seas Toolkit, you should come up to our page where you can access all of our resources completely free. And so these are available online. These resources are themed into three sections, basically. So thematically, they look at the regulatory section, the operations, as well as capacity. And you mentioned how will it be accessed and used by small-scale fishers. In this first phase of the Smart Seas project that we're working on right now, the focus isn't necessarily directly on the small-scale fishers themselves, but the enabling environment. And as such, these resources have been geared for the different actors and agencies outside of the small-scale fishers to strengthen their regulatory compliance, their operations, as well as capacity. Of course, there are some resources that are available there for small-scale fishers, which include guidelines and radio guides on how to use the maritime radios, just really some bite-sized information for their consuming. So those resources, as I mentioned, they're freely accessible, not really geared towards the small-scale fishers, although there are some resources that can benefit them.
Thanks, Tariq. So you mentioned phases. So this one per se is not for them. So what's the time frame for the project and what are the different phases?
So in this first phase, we started in December 2021, and we're looking at wrapping up this phase by June of next year, so June 2025. So we have just about 7 months left on the project, for which there's still a lot of work to be done. Phase 2, which will come a bit later on, focuses more on getting to the small-scale fishers, continuing some of the work that we've done in phase 1, and really working with administrations outside of the scope of the 4 countries that we're looking at right now. So maybe we can have a greater focus on, say, the ECTEL countries to really support and continue motivating their development in this focus area that we're looking at.
Okay, great. No, I'm glad to hear that there's another phase and you'll be zoning in more on the fishers because yes, you may have the guidelines on the website, but realistically, we may not get the fishers going there to find them. So, maybe we could talk again when you get to that phase to see what are some of the practical ways you're going to be bringing across or bringing the toolkit to life for these fishers. All right. So what outcomes or changes do you hope to see once the toolkit is fully implemented? I know you have quite a way to go, but what are some of the outcomes or changes you hope to see?
For one, we would definitely like to see all of the CTU member states fulfilling its obligations under the ITU conventions, as well as other UN conventions in the maritime communication side of things. So what we really want to see once the toolkit is implemented is to fill the gaps that we've identified. We'd like to see that there is an enabling environment and a set of actors and agencies out there within the ecosystem that have both the interest as well as resources, so to speak, all different kinds of resources to adequately address the issue of unaffordable, inaccessible communications for fishers.
Okay. All right. So where you mentioned earlier, but do you have the specific websites for persons who want to learn more about the Smart Seas project? Where could they go to get this information? Just remind us of where again?
Right. So all of the information about the Smart Seas project, including all of the work that we've done, all of our resources are available on each of the partners' websites. So that's the ITU, CTU, and TAT. For ease of reference, let's use the CTU as an example. You can access it at going to www.ctu.int. Once you get to the website, you'll see a tab on the top saying Smart Seas Project. Just click there and all of the information will be right there waiting for you.
Yes, it was very easy to find, Tariq. Yes, right there at the top, as you said. Okay, so before I ask you if there are any closing remarks, in looking at your bio, I see that you're not only the project consultant on the Smart Seas initiative, but you're doing a lot of other work with the youth and the internet. You want to tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So apart from my role as the project officer in Smart Seas, as well as being a part-time postgraduate student, I do a lot of pro bono work in youth involvement and inclusion. So what we have been doing at the CTU as well as ITU levels in the past is recognizing that we have a lot of young talent in the Caribbean. We really need to find ways to cultivate the next generation of ICT leaders, developers, entrepreneurs. And so I've been doing a lot of work, particularly with IEEE, which is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers in Trinidad and Tobago, the Young Professional Program, as well as the Caribbean Telecommunication Union's Caribbean Youth Internet Governance Forum, which is now recognized by the UN as a regional initiative to bring more youth representation and inclusion in the sphere of ICTs. A project that we are trying to launch, it was unofficially launched, but we're still working on it right now, is the Caribbean ICT Youth Network, or CIYN as we're calling it, which is an open and free call for any young persons and young professionals in ICTs looking really between the ages of 18 to 35, though we may look a little younger for junior members. But what we really want to see and what we really want to provide the opportunity for is to make accessible the different opportunities and capacity building and networking for youth, both with youth across different countries or within the same countries, as well as having that dialogue between young professionals, students, and the more experienced industry experts or regulatory experts. So that's still an initiative that we're trying to get some further support from in the Caribbean. And we do have a call for anyone who's interested, an expression of interest form, which I can happily share with you anytime you're available.
Awesome, Tariq. And maybe we could invite you in the future when things are firmed up for that initiative and you'd like to talk more about it. And we could just have a program on that if you're open to it in the future.
Of course.
Awesome. So any closing remarks on the Smart Seas project?
Firstly, I just want to thank you for having us here today, allowing us to come and share more about our project. While we have spent a lot of time working with administrations and with the key actors within the ecosystem, we always appreciate the opportunity to do continued work, to continue networking and engaging with other actors. So really, this is a call to action for anyone who's listening and who may be interested or have some sort of means of working with us. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time. Our email is sst@ctu.int. You can send us an email and we would love to work with you. We'd love to hear your thoughts or any opinions on what it is we can do better, what it is we should include, and really make it a very collaborative, multi-stakeholder process to really look at not just producing results, but those that are meaningful and fit for purpose. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was excellent, Tariq. Thanks for being our guest on episode 28 of ECTEL Bytes. And in case you joined us late, our very special guest was Mr. Tariq Mohammed, the Project Consultant Officer at the ITU. And he shared quite a bit of information about their Smart Seas project that would be of interest to small-scale fishers, etc., in the Caribbean. And we need your help to get the word out about this initiative. And so ensure to share and like the post, because it's really important work in the end if we're going to be protecting our fishers out at seas and also sparing their families the distress as well. So we really hope that you enjoyed this program. And if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comment section below and we'll be sure to reply. Apart from being on our Facebook page, the recording of ECTEL Bytes will also be on our YouTube channel, which is also at ECTEL. It'll also be on Instagram, X, and LinkedIn at ECTEL Authority. And of course, it'll be on our website, which is www.ectel.int. So be sure to share with your contacts who may not be on Facebook. And in case you've been listening to the radio version of ECTEL Bytes, we wrap up in December with our final 3 shows on December 5th, 12th, and 19th. So you could listen again to Tariq there. So please tell persons who might not be on social media to join us on those dates. We'll be on Q95 in the Commonwealth of Dominica at 10:45 a.m., We FM in Grenada at 9:30, Freedom FM in St. Kitts and Nevis at 1:15, Radio Caribbean International in St. Lucia at 10 a.m., and at 10:45 a.m. in St. Vincent and the Grenadines on Extreme Radio 104 FM. So that's it for episode 28 of ECTEL Bytes. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again virtually. I'm your host, Coretta Cook-Charles, ECTEL's Communications and Media Relations Manager. Thanks for watching, and until next time, do take care and keep safe.